On May 12, 1943, in the perilous Atlantic waters, Kriegsmarine submarine U-456 vanished with all hands on deck.
In the cold Atlantic, submarines hunted unseen, while convoys vanished into black water, and Allied crews searched desperately for an answer that could hear what eyes could not. When a secret weapon finally arrived, its greatest strength was not power, but the silence protecting it. The Atlantic crisis, the invisible war, begins. By 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had become a relentless battlefield where survival depended less on firepower and more on detection, because German U-boats could strike without warning and disappear beneath the surface before escorts reacted. Allied convoys carrying fuel, food, and ammunition crossed thousands of miles of open water. Yet each voyage felt like a gamble, as a single submarine could cripple multiple ships in minutes and leave survivors drifting in freezing seas. Escort destroyers dropped depth charges based on estimates, hoping explosions would land close enough to force a kill, but submarines often escaped by changing depth or slipping into darkness after firing. Inside naval headquarters, commanders watched loss reports rise and understood that replacing ships alone would never solve the problem because the real weakness lay in outdated anti-submarine tactics. Pilots and sailors needed something that could continue hunting after an attack began, something that did not rely on guesswork or chance. That urgency pushed scientists and military planners toward a radical idea, a weapon designed not to explode blindly, but to listen, follow, and strike beneath the waves. A weapon hidden behind a lie, the birth of the mine. As convoy losses mounted, Allied scientists began developing a weapon that sounded more like theory than practical engineering, a device that could guide itself underwater by tracking sound instead of relying on timed explosions. Research teams from the US Navy and institutions like Harvard's Underwater Sound Laboratory worked in secrecy, experimenting with acoustic sensors capable of identifying the steady rhythm of submarine propellers. The result became the Mark 24, but officials deliberately labeled it a mine because the word suggested a passive explosive rather than a self-guided hunter, reducing the risk of enemy intelligence understanding its true purpose. Engineers faced skepticism from officers who doubted fragile listening systems could survive real combat conditions. Yet, repeated trials proved the concept workable, showing that a compact weapon could enter the water, stabilize itself, and begin searching independently. Secrecy shaped every step, from documentation to training, since commanders feared that even rumors of such technology might encourage countermeasures before it reached the battlefield. By the time testing ended, planners realized they were preparing to deploy something unprecedented, a weapon that did not rely on luck, but on patience and sound. Hunting in silence, how the weapon worked. When released from patrol aircraft, the Mark 24 entered the water quietly, stabilizing itself before activating a guidance system built around underwater listening devices called hydrophones. Instead of racing toward a target at high speed, it moved steadily, analyzing vibrations and steering toward the strongest acoustic source, usually the engine or propeller noise of a submarine attempting to escape. This approach differed sharply from depth charges, which relied on rough estimates and explosive force, because the new weapon continued searching after the aircraft had left the area. Submarine crews were trained to evade attacks by changing depth or direction, yet this tactic offered less protection against something that adjusted course automatically, following sound through darkness where human operators could no longer see or react. Pilots often described deployment as tense rather than dramatic, since there was no immediate explosion, only a waiting period while sonar operators listened for signs that the weapon had found its target. The true innovation was not raw destructive power, but persistence, because it transformed anti-submarine warfare into a quiet pursuit driven by acoustics rather than guesswork. First kills and the psychological shock. When the weapon entered combat in 1943, early missions produced results that surprised even its creators, because submarines that previously slipped away after air attacks were suddenly being damaged or destroyed without clear explanation. Patrol crews reported delayed explosions and oil rising to the surface long after aircraft had departed, suggesting that the device continued hunting independently beneath the waves. German U-boat commanders struggled to understand the new threat, since traditional evasive maneuvers often failed, and intelligence reports described attacks that felt almost invisible compared to depth charge patterns they recognized. Allied pilots gained confidence as confirmed sinkings increased, yet strict secrecy prevented them from discussing details outside operational circles, reinforcing the sense that they were using something unusual and carefully guarded. Over time, the weapon proved highly effective relative to earlier methods, changing expectations for anti-submarine patrols and forcing enemy crews to adopt quieter operating practices that slowed their movements and reduced aggressiveness. The psychological impact spread quickly because uncertainty itself became a weapon, and submariners could no longer assume that escaping an aircraft meant safety. The Deepwater Secret: why it had to disappear. Despite its success, commanders feared the weapon's greatest risk was not failure, but discovery. Because if a missed device were recovered, enemy engineers could study its acoustic guidance and design countermeasures. Operational orders therefore required crews to deploy it only in deep water, generally around 150 feet or more, ensuring that any unused weapon would sink beyond practical salvage. This restriction shaped mission planning, since aircraft sometimes tracked submarines, but could not attack if depth conditions were unsuitable, forcing crews to balance immediate opportunity against long-term secrecy. The rule reflected a strange paradox. The weapon's power depended on remaining unseen, even when that meant sacrificing potential kills. Pilots followed the directive knowing that preserving the secret might save more lives later, while intelligence officers monitored reports carefully to confirm no examples had fallen into enemy hands. In a war defined by visibility and detection, the most effective tool often worked best when it vanished completely into the ocean. The war beneath the surface: strategic impact. As deployments expanded, the weapon quietly reshaped anti-submarine warfare by increasing the likelihood that an aircraft sighting would end in real damage rather than a missed opportunity. Convoys began crossing the Atlantic with improving survival rates, and commanders noticed that U-boat behavior changed as crews reduced speed and operated more cautiously to avoid producing detectable noise. The new pressure forced submarines to spend longer periods submerged, limiting their range and effectiveness while giving Allied escorts more control over shipping routes. Although it did not end the submarine threat alone, the weapon became part of a broader technological shift that combined radar, sonar, intelligence tracking, and air patrol coordination into a more effective defensive system. Historians later described this period as a turning phase in the Battle of the Atlantic, where incremental innovations collectively tipped the balance toward Allied control. Beneath the surface, the war remained invisible to most people. Yet, decisions made in laboratories and patrol aircraft altered the rhythm of an entire global conflict. Legacy of a weapon that almost stayed unknown. After the war, much of the weapon's story remained hidden for years, since secrecy rules delayed public discussion, and many veterans rarely spoke about the details of its use. When documents were finally declassified, historians recognized how advanced the acoustic guidance concept had been, influencing later generations of homing torpedoes and underwater tracking systems. What once sounded experimental became a foundation for modern anti-submarine strategy, proving that careful engineering and disciplined operational secrecy could reshape warfare without dramatic public recognition. The weapon's legacy lies not only in the submarines it helped destroy, but in the idea that listening, patience, and precision could outperform brute force in an environment where visibility meant almost nothing. Long after the Atlantic battles ended, its quiet logic continued echoing through naval research, reminding planners that the most decisive innovations are often the ones few people notice at the time. Beneath the Atlantic's surface, victory sometimes depended on inventions that left no visible trace, only silence and absence where danger once moved freely. The Mark 24 proved that listening could change the course of war, and even today, unseen ideas continue shaping outcomes long before history notices.